It was on the brisk afternoon of October the 3rd that I, Captain Arthur Hastings, found myself once again in the company of my old friend Hercule Poirot. We had just returned from a brief sojourn in the Cotswolds, during which Poirot had availed himself of the opportunity to lament the British preference for boiled vegetables and to speak at length on the merits of symmetry in architecture. I had hoped, perhaps naively, that this might be a rare moment of tranquility in our otherwise tumultuous lives. But, as always, fate had other plans. We had scarcely settled into our rooms at Whitehaven Mansions when the concierge knocked with a note. Poirot, ever fastidious, opened it with his silver paper knife and read it in silence, his eyebrows rising ever so slightly. "Well, mon ami," he said at last, "it appears we are invited to a weekend at Davenheim Manor." "Davenheim Manor," I repeated. "That sounds frightfully grand. Who's the host?" Poirot handed me the note. It was written in a flowing, rather theatrical hand. "Monsieur Poirot, your reputation precedes you. I write to extend an invitation of some urgency and delicacy. I am hosting a gathering at my family home, Davenheim Manor, in Kent. Among the guests are individuals of considerable influence and sensitivity. There has been ... an incident. I dare not put more in writing, please. Consider this a personal request. Discretion, I assure you, is paramount. Sincerely, Vivian Foscar." "Vivian Foscar?" I asked. The name struck a faint chord, though I could not immediately place it. "She is a patron of the arts, I believe," Poirot said, folding the note neatly. "Very rich, very private, and possessed of a certain ... mystique. The Foscar family is old money, with connections both theatrical and political. I suspect this invitation is not extended lightly. She said there was an incident." "Sounds promising," I said cheerfully. "Shall we go?" Poirot gave a small nod. "We shall, mon ami. We owe it to our curiosity, if nothing else." The next day, undisguised, that threatened rain but never quite delivered. We took the train to Kent. Davenheim Manor, when we reached it, proved to be an imposing Victorian structure perched atop a wooded hill, overlooking the grey waters of the River Medway. The house, built in red brick with high arched windows and peculiar gargoyles that leered from the corners of the roof, had the weary grandeur of a place accustomed to secrets. We were received at the great carved oak door by a rather strict butler named Graves. He informed us with stiff courtesy that Miss Foscar was expecting us and led us through an expansive vestibule to a drawing-room lined with tapestries and ancient oil portraits. Vivian Foscar was a tall woman in her mid-40s, elegantly dressed in deep green velvet. Her hair, black and glossy, was pinned in a chignon, and she wore a necklace of sapphire beads that shimmered even in the muted light. Her manner was calm, almost cold, but there was tension in her eyes that belied the outward poise. "Poirot," she said, rising as we entered, "I am grateful you came, and you must be Captain Hastings. Welcome to Davenheim." She motioned for us to sit. "There are 12 guests in total this weekend," she began without preamble, "including yourselves. I have invited people from varied parts of my life, artists, politicians, one or two old family acquaintances. There is no theme to the gathering, except that I chose each person for a reason. I hoped it would be a pleasant, perhaps even healing retreat, but something has gone terribly wrong." She paused and poured herself a glass of sherry, but did not drink this morning. She continued, "I discovered that a family heirloom has gone missing." "A mask," I said, intrigued. Poirot leaned forward. "Please describe it, madame." "It is known as the Sapphire Mask, a Venetian piece, 17th century, blue enamel inlaid with small sapphires, some real, some glass. It was passed down through my mother's side, the Montaubains. It is, I admit, a rather theatrical object, but its value is not merely monetary. There is something menacing about it, something people whisper about. It was locked in a glass case in the music room. Now the case is broken, and the mask is gone." Poirot's eyes glittered. "And there are no signs of forced entry?" "None," she said tightly. "The only people who have been in the house are the guests and the staff, who have been with us for years. And, of course, myself." "Curious," Poirot murmured, "and why not call the police?" "I do not wish to draw attention to the theft," she replied with a trace of steel in her voice. "The guests are prominent. There would be gossip, scandal. I hoped you might resolve the matter quietly." Poirot nodded slowly. "Very well. I accept the case. But tell me, have you reason to believe that this theft is only the beginning?" Vivian hesitated. Then she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I have reason to believe the mask is cursed." Later that evening, Poirot and I joined the rest of the weekend party for dinner in the long dining hall, where candlelight flickered across the mahogany and the glinting silverware. The assembled guests were, as Vivian had promised, an eclectic bunch. There was Sir Barnaby Trent, a bombastic member of Parliament with a florid face and a booming laugh. Cecilia Lavery, a former stage actress with eyes like polished jet and a string of husbands behind her. Dr. Elias Hargrove, a gaunt psychiatrist who observed everyone with clinical dispassion. And Isabel Foscar, Vivian's younger cousin, pale, and seemingly always on the edge of tears. There was also Rupert Glanville, a journalist with an eager eye for scandal. Mardy and Geoffrey Risley, a rather nervous middle-aged couple who spoke little, Lucien Marchand, a French art dealer with exquisitely manicured hands and a tendency to mutter in his native tongue. And finally Diana Harwood, a sharp-featured woman in her 30s who worked for the Foreign Office. To say the atmosphere was tense would be putting it mildly. There's a sense, I murmured to Poirot as we took our seats, that none of them really knows why they're here. Mais oui, Hastings, Poirot murmured, and that is precisely why we must observe them, carefully, with patience. He leaned back and watched as the footman served soup. Around us conversation buzzed lightly yet never quite sincerely. Poirot's eyes lingered on the flickering candelabras and the guests' faces half lit by flame. The mask, he said softly, is but the beginning. It was some hours past midnight when a sound woke me. I had always fancied myself a reasonably heavy sleeper, but at Davenheim Manor, with its long corridors and strange architecture, even a creaking floorboard took on sinister undertones. I lay in bed, listening. First, all was still. Then again, a faint tapping, the subtle groan of weight upon timber, the sigh of a door opening somewhere in the vast house. I rose and pulled on my dressing gown. The fire in the grate had gone cold. Outside my window, the Kentish fog clung thick about the hedgerows, making even the trees look suspicious. I stepped out into the corridor, lit only by the silver light of the moon spilling in through stained glass panes. Somewhere a clock chimed 2. Just as I rounded the turn toward the main gallery, I nearly collided with Poirot. Hastings, he whispered. You also heard it? Yes, footsteps. Exactly, he said, finger raised. They were careful, very careful, but not careful enough. We crept forward together, Poirot in his immaculate silk slippers, me feeling rather less stealthy in mine. We turned into the southern wing, passing the music room, its tall doors shut fast, then along the narrow corridor that led to the old billiard lounge. It was there we found the broken glass. A large shard glinted faintly on the floor just beneath the tall antique display case, the same case Vivian Foscar had described earlier that day, the one that, until recently, had contained the sapphire mask. Poirot bent low. No further damage, he murmured. Only this one piece, dislodged since this afternoon. Curious. I suppose whoever took the mask dropped it then, I asked. He shook his head. No, mon ami. See here. He pointed to the inside of the case. There is dust disturbed, but not removed. The mark of fingers, yet no smear consistent with the lifting of the mask again. It was opened before dinner, as Madame Foscar told us. This, he pointed to the broken shard on the floor, is new. I turned as another sound reached us, the quiet click of a latch. Poirot held up a hand and stepped into shadow. From the end of the hallway came a figure, tall, stooping slightly, moving with tentative caution. Poirot stepped out. Bonsoir, Dr. Hargrove, he said gently. The psychiatrist started, then composed himself swiftly. I might say the same to you, Monsieur Poirot. You are out late, said Poirot, a troubled mind. Hargrove's thin mouth twisted into a wry smile. You might say I'm prone to insomnia, or perhaps that old houses hold too many memories. In any case, I was walking to clear my head, and found yourself passing the scene of the theft. Poirot gestured toward the display case. I've worked with patients who steal compulsively. You know, said Hargrove mildly, folding his hands behind his back. Often it has little to do with the object itself. The act is the release. Perhaps that applies here. Perhaps, Poirot said softly, though the question remains who, and why now? Hargrove inclined his head and walked off without another word. At breakfast the party was quiet, strained. The grand dining hall, with its high windows and carved mantelpiece, seemed to press in around us. Eggs were half-eaten, toast untouched. Everyone seemed to sense that something had shifted. Vivian Foscar appeared last, composed as ever but pale. I must inform you all, she said in clear, ringing tones, that the mask stolen from my family collection is yet to be recovered. Monsieur Poirot has kindly agreed to make discreet inquiries, and I expect you all to cooperate fully. There were murmurs of polite assent. Poirot rose. Mesdames et messieurs, he said. I shall begin by speaking to each of you today. Nothing intrusive, nothing formal. I am not the police, but a small matter, a matter of curiosity has caught my attention. He held up a hand. The mask was taken. Yes, but last night, someone returned to the scene. Someone came very close to revealing themselves, and then drew back. He looked around the table. Every face was guarded, every gesture tight. Isabel. Foscar's cup rattled slightly in its saucer. Sir Barnaby fidgeted with his napkin. Lucien Marchand narrowed his eyes ever so slightly. No one spoke. Poirot nodded. Then I shall begin. Isabel Foscar met Poirot in the small conservatory that overlooked the frosty-stowed lawns. She was dressed in dove grey and wore no jewelry, save for a delicate silver ring on one finger. You must think me terribly nervous, she said with a small smile. I suppose I am. Madame, I think only that you are troubled by something, Poirot replied gently. Perhaps something unrelated to the theft, but weighing on your spirit nonetheless. Her eyes welled up instantly. It's this house, she whispered. This family. You don't know what it's like living with a Foscar name. Everything's always hidden, swept under the rug. Secrets wrapped in veils. You believe there are secrets behind the theft. She hesitated. I don't know, but I do know that Vivian has never been entirely honest about the mask. She says it's just an heirloom, but my mother told me it was used in something terrible, a performance, or a ritual, I don't know which. There were whispers. Do you fear it? Poirot asked. Yes, she said simply. I always have. Poirot next turned to Sir Barnaby, who was pacing the library, smoking a pipe with theatrical exaggeration. Dash it all, Poirot, he said. This is all a bit melodramatic, don't you think? A missing trinket and a household full of suspicion. Sounds like the second act of a bad play. Poirot smiled thinly. And yet you stayed. Professional curiosity, Sir Barnaby said. I've been on 4 committees with Vivian. She has a knack for attracting drama. If there's scandal brewing, I prefer to be at the front lines. You were in the music room yesterday afternoon. Briefly. Looking for a scotch. You did not notice the broken case. I noticed plenty, Sir Barnaby said, puffing. But I also know when to keep my mouth shut. For instance, I know Rupert Glanville has been sniffing around for gossip, and that Diana Harwood receives diplomatic pouches far more often than anyone from the Foreign Office has business needing. Poirot inclined his head. And the mask, did it interest you? Not particularly. But I heard someone say it was cursed. That sort of thing makes the papers sell, doesn't it? That afternoon, as Poirot was preparing his next round of interviews, Graves the butler brought him a note. It was unsigned. You are being watched. The mask is only the beginning. Tell no one. Especially not her. Poirot studied the message without expression. He said, folding it crisply. The game, Hastings, is accelerating. I glanced at him. Do you believe it's a prank? Nan, I believe someone is attempting to direct our attention. The question is toward what, or away from whom he stood. We shall see who is nervous, who is eager, and who is to calm. There is always someone who missteps. The following morning, Davenheim Manor was sheathed in an eerie calm, the sort that settles over a place in anticipation of something yet unseen. The fog from the night before had thinned but lingered in low, spectral patches across the garden. Breakfast was a silent affair. The guests, though seated together, behaved as though they were each alone. Sir Barnaby read the Times with exaggerated interest. Rupert Glanville scribbled into a small notebook. Vivian Foscar did not appear. Poirot, seated beside me, sipped his coffee with delicate precision. He had already conducted 2 more quiet interviews before breakfast. Geoffrey Risley, who said almost nothing of note, and Marty, who was evasive in a manner that raised Poirot's eyebrows ever so slightly. Now, as the guests dispersed into their various morning activities, bridge in the parlor, a reluctant stroll on the grounds, Poirot beckoned me quietly. Hastings, he said, we shall now examine the music room, the scene of the crime, but of course, and it is high time we give it the attention it deserves. The music room at Davenheim Manor was not so much a room as a long gallery converted from what had once been a conservatory. The ceiling arched high in glass panels, mottled with age and ivy, casting a dappled light across the parquet floor. Along the far wall stood an upright piano, its surface dustless and recently polished. Near it, in the center of the room, stood the glass display cabinet, tall, Gothic in style, with fluted wooden corners and brass hinges. It was open now, the lock intact, but one pane in the lower section had clearly been cracked and dislodged. The very shard Poirot had discovered the night before. He knelt to inspect the frame again, magnifying glass in hand. Note, Hastings, he murmured. The break is recent, jagged, but the surrounding dust sea here is undisturbed save for one clear set of fingerprints, which we already knew were from the initial theft. Perhaps or perhaps not. We assume too much. Always. The danger. He turned his attention to the plinth inside the cabinet. This is where the mask rested. The velvet cushion is slightly indented. The shape of the sapphires left minute impressions. And do you see this? He pointed to the back of the cabinet. I leaned in a strand, he said, caught between the plinth and the wooden back. He extracted it with tweezers. It was barely visible but unmistakable, long fine thread of deep auburn, human hair. A clue, I said. Poirot pocketed the hair with great care. Or a misdirection. Either way, it tells us something. There are no auburn-haired guests at Davenheim, not naturally, unless you count Miss Lavery, though I suspect her particular shade owes more to the theatre than to nature. He stood abruptly. Come, there is another room that interests me, the portrait gallery. The portrait gallery ran along the eastern wing of the house, lined with gilt-framed oil paintings of stern-faced Foscar's past. It had the air of a place built for remembrance but fallen into neglect. The floorboards creaked, and the scent of furniture polish could not quite mask the underlying damp. Poirot moved from canvas to canvas, his gaze sharp and analytic. He paused at a painting of a masked figure, garbed in elaborate Venetian attire. The background was a stage. The curtain midfall, that, he said, is the Sapphire Mask. The painting, dated 1898, was signed to Foscar, entitled La Masque. The figure in the image wore a half-mask of rich lapis, studded with what appeared to be sapphires around the rim. It was undeniably theatrical, too vivid for ritual, too mysterious for mere ornament. The wearer's identity was hidden, but the eyes, deep and piercing, seemed almost to glow. There's something uncanny about it, I said. Poirot agreed. This is not a piece made merely for beauty. It speaks of performance, of concealment. And look, he pointed to the corner. There's a plaque. Read it if you please. I did. Commissioned by Alonso Foscar after the incident in Milan. Warn once, never again. Poirot nodded gravely. Warn once, never again. What happened in Milan, I wonder? We were silent for a moment. You think, I asked, that the mask is what Vivian Foscar claims it is? An heirloom with a reputation? Or something darker? Poirot did not answer at first. Then he said, I think, mon ami, that there is always truth in legend, however deeply buried, and legends, like clues, have a habit of revealing themselves when the mind is ready. We returned to the corridor near the study, intending to examine the library. As we passed a narrow hall between the gallery and the main staircase, we heard voices. Poirot stopped, gently motioning me back. We waited, just out of sight. It was Rupert Glanville speaking. His voice was low, urgent. You promised it would be over by now. You said she wouldn't suspect. A woman's voice replied sharp. Anxious. Keep your voice down. Anyone could be listening. If Vivian finds out. Poirot stepped forward deliberately. The voices cut off. Ah, Monsieur Glanville, Poirot said with a slight bow, and Madame Harwood. A private conversation. Do not let me intrude. Both looked startled, though Diana Harwood recovered quickly. We were discussing a newspaper article, she said smoothly. Something we both had interest in. A coincidence. Indeed, Poirot replied. Coincidences are, as you say, very interesting things. He let the silence stretch just long enough before continuing. I wonder if either of you might provide me with your movements yesterday between 4 and 5 o'clock. Rupert flushed. I was in the library. And I, Diana said evenly. Was in my room alone, Poirot asked. Yes, he inclined his head. Mercy, that is all, for now. As they parted ways, Poirot said softly to me, 2 people, both lying, but about what? That evening, after dinner, Poirot received a message from Vivian Foscar requesting a private word. We found her in the sunken parlor, seated beside a grand fireplace. A decanter of port sat untouched on a silver tray. I've remembered something, she said. It may be nothing, but after speaking with you, I couldn't sleep last night. I went through my mother's old journals. Poirot sat opposite her, steepling his fingers. She wrote of the mask more than I expected. Vivian continued. It wasn't just a family heirloom. She believed it was connected to an event in 1902, a séance held by my great-uncle Alonso. Apparently, during the séance, one of the guests died. A heart attack, they claimed, but my mother suspected something else. She said the mask was part of the performance, that it was never meant to be worn. She shivered. I never believed in such things, but the day the mask vanished, I found this. She handed Poirot a piece of paper. It was folded, yellowed with age. In faded ink was written, do not wear the mask. It sees more than we do. It remembers. Poirot stared at the note in silence. Madame, he said finally, you have told me something very important. Thank you. As we walked back to our rooms, I turned to him. You look troubled, Poirot. I am thoughtful, Hastings. The mask has a past that someone fears, and fear, it is the most revealing emotion of all. It makes people act foolishly. He paused at the foot of the stairs, and I believe, Hastings, that it will make someone act again soon. The following day dawned dull and grey, as though the house itself had decided to mourn. Rain streaked the windows in slender rivulets, and a persistent wind sighed through the old chimneys of Davenheim Manor. At breakfast, the guests were fewer in number than usual. Cecilia, Lavery and Lucien Marching had sent word they would take breakfast in their rooms, and Miss Isabel Foscar had yet to emerge. Vivian Foscar, composed but clearly wearied, presided at the head of the long table. Poirot, beside me, seemed more alert than ever, his eyes flickering from guest to guest, his spoon stirring his porridge in a rhythm that suggested he was thinking deeply. He leaned in. Hastings, today I wish to speak with Mademoiselle, if she interests me. She's certainly dramatic enough, I replied, buttering my toast. Do you suppose she's hiding something? Mais naturellement. Everyone here is hiding something. That is not the question. The question is, which secret is relevant to our little drama? We found Cecilia Lavery in the blue drawing room at 10:30. She was reclining dramatically on a chaise longue, wearing a black silk robe adorned with silver dragons, her auburn hair perfectly arranged despite her claim of having slept badly. On the table beside her sat a cigarette case, half empty, and an empty sherry glass. She greeted Poirot with a theatrical flourish of her hand. Come to interrogate the fallen diva, she asked with a throaty laugh. Poirot bowed. Merely to converse, mademoiselle. I find conversation far more illuminating than interrogation. May I ask, you were once a pianist, were you not? She looked surprised. A long time ago. Before the stage claimed me. How curious you should know that. I observed your hands, the length of the fingers, the strength in the joints. Not the hands of someone idle. And the small callus here, he pointed delicately on the 4th finger. From years of repetition, she gave a slow smile. You are observant, Monsieur Poirot. Yes, I was once something of a prodigy. My mother wanted me to be a concert pianist, but I went another way. And now you play no longer. Oh, very rarely, she said. Not since... Well, since Harold died. Your husband, she stiffened. My fiancé drowned 2 years ago, off the coast of Amalfi. I was not with him, she exhaled. Vivian and I were traveling together when I received the news. It changed everything. Was it Vivian who invited you here? Yes, she said. It would do me good to be among old friends. I'm not sure I agree. Poirot's gaze narrowed slightly. Mademoiselle, were you in the music room the day before last? Yes, she said, surprised. Around 4 o'clock. I went in because I saw the piano. I played for a moment, only a moment. You did not notice the broken case? No, she said. I left quickly. It upset me, he nodded. May I ask, what piece did you play? She blinked. Debussy, Clair de Lune. Why? Poirot smiled. Because the stool is not positioned for someone to play, and the keys bear no dust marks. The lid was closed. You did not play, mademoiselle. Why say that you did? Cecilia Lavery looked away. Because I was there, but not for the piano. Then for what? For him, she whispered. Lucien Marching, we ... spoke, in private. He asked me not to say I agreed, but I saw him leave the music room. He looked frightened. Poirot bowed again. Merci, mademoiselle. You have told me something useful. It was not difficult to arrange a meeting with Lucien Marching. He was seated in the library, sketching in a small notebook. A half-finished portrait, clearly of Miss Lavery, was visible on the page. Poirot, he said, setting the notebook aside, I imagine you are here about the mask. We, among other things. Tell me, M. Marching, why did you meet Miss Lavery in the music room? He gave a Gallic shrug. We are old acquaintances. Once in Paris, she modeled for a catalogue. I was preparing for a gallery exhibit. Nothing scandalous, portraits, mostly. And now, he hesitated. We are not lovers, if that is your suggestion. But we speak with ... familiarity. Poirot tapped his fingers together. You were in the music room at 4. The mask was still present then. Yes, I admired it. I even drew it. He showed us a page from the notebook, a quick sketch of the Sapphire Mask in profile. You saw no one else? No. Then why did Miss Lavery say you looked frightened when you left? Lucien paused. Because of what I saw in the mask. Poirot waited. In the glass, Lucien said quietly. I saw someone behind me, in the reflection. A shape, a face. But when I turned, no one was there. A trick of the light, perhaps. Perhaps, said Lucien, but I have a feeling. It was not. That afternoon, the rain ceased briefly, and Poirot insisted we walk the grounds. We wandered past the hedges, through the overgrown rose garden, until we reached a low stone structure set back from the house. It was a folly, a decorative ruin, built for no reason but to please the eye. Poirot examined the doorway. It was half covered in ivy. He cleared some of it aside and entered. I followed. Inside we found only shadows and damp, until Poirot knelt by the wall. Here, he said. In the corner, half covered by moss and leaves, lay a scrap of dark blue fabric, the same velvet Vivian had described as the inner lining of the mask's case. It was here, Poirot said. Someone brought it out here. But why? He turned suddenly and looked upward. Because they were going to dispose of it, he said slowly, and then changed their mind. A second crime. We returned to the house just as the bell rang out. Loud, frantic. The guests were gathered in the drawing room. Vivian Foscar stood in the doorway, pale as ash. It's Rupert, she said. Rupert Glanville. He's dead. A stunned silence followed. Poirot sprang into action. Where? The library, she whispered. We followed at once. The room was still and chill. Rupert lay slumped at the writing desk, his head turned to the side, eyes staring sightlessly. His notebook was on the floor. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, only a single teacup on the desk beside him. Poirot leaned in, sniffed and carefully examined the cup. Poison, he said shortly. But why? I asked. He wasn't the one who stole the mask, was he? Poirot turned to me, his eyes grim. No, Hastings. I believe Rupert was killed because he knew who did. The death of Rupert Glanville cast a heavy pall over Davenheim Manor. Though the wind had died and the skies had lightened, the house itself seemed darker, quieter, as though the very walls had drawn in to listen. The guests, already strained by suspicion over the theft, were now gripped by a more immediate fear. Murder had entered the scene. Vivian Foscar acted swiftly, telephoning the local police and notifying them of Rupert's death. Though at Poirot's suggestion she was careful in her phrasing. The authorities would arrive within the hour, but Poirot, as was often the case, had already begun his inquiry. Rupert's body had been moved to a guest bedroom and covered with a heavy woolen blanket. The teacup, however, remained precisely as it had been discovered. Poirot stood at the library desk, arms folded, gazing down at it. You are certain it was poisoned? I asked. Oui, mon ami, the odor is faint, but unmistakable. Bitter almonds, cyanide, I believe, or a compound thereof. He gestured to the nearby sideboard, where a silver tea service had been laid out. You will note, no sign of tampering here. And yet, only Rupert drank his tea. The others had coffee in the parlor. Then it must have been prepared specially. Precisely, said Poirot. Rupert likely poured it himself. He was alone here for some time. I frowned. So either someone poisoned the tea in advance, or delivered the poison in some other fashion. Poirot nodded slowly. There are two possibilities. The poison was in the cup when he poured, or it was introduced after. Both suggest forethought. Both require access. He turned. Come, Hastings. Let us speak with Graves. Graves received us in the butler's pantry, standing rigidly beside a shelf of meticulously labeled linens. I understand Rupert Glanville died this morning, he said grimly. Tragic business. You served tea in the library today? Poirot asked. No, sir. I prepared the tea tray. Yes, but I left it outside the library at Mr. Glanville's instruction. He said he preferred to pour for himself. I returned 15 minutes later to collect the tray and he broke off swallowing. Gone. Who else came near the tray? No one that I saw, sir. Poirot nodded. And the cup was the one he always used. Graves's expression shifted. No, sir. That's just it. Mr. Glanville had a particular fondness for the Wedgwood set, blue rim, white porcelain, but the cup found beside him, it was one of the plain service. Said odd. That terse, interestant, murmured Poirot. Later that afternoon, Isabelle Foscar asked to speak privately with Poirot. We found her in the morning room, wringing her hands and pacing. I can't keep silent anymore, she said in a rush. I know I should. Vivian would be furious. But I have to say something. Poirot motioned for her to sit. I found something in Rupert's room yesterday, she said. Before he died, I was returning a book he'd lent me, and I knocked, but he wasn't in. The door was ajar. I stepped in. I know I shouldn't have, and on the desk was a letter. It mentioned the mask. A letter. Yes, typed, from someone calling themselves M. It said, "You were warned. The mask is not to be used again. Return it or suffer the consequences." Poirot's brow lifted. Do you recall the rest? Only that it was signed M, nothing else. No name, just an initial. Rupert had underlined part of it. Used again, as if that was what mattered most. And you told no one. I didn't know what to do, and now he's dead. Poirot nodded gently. You have done well to speak now, mademoiselle. Tell me, did you ever see Rupert with the mask? She paled. No, but I think he knew who took it. He was always watching people, listening. Poirot said nothing, but his eyes glittered with thought. Poirot's next conversation was with Dr. Elias Hargrove, who had been silent all day. The psychiatrist was seated in the billiard lounge, staring out into the misty afternoon beyond the French doors. You are familiar with poisons, doctor? Poirot asked without preamble. I've studied their psychological effects. Certainly, Hargrove replied, not turning. Cyanide is brutal, fast, terrifying. You speak as though from experience. I once treated a woman who tried to kill her husband with cyanide hidden in sugar. He survived. She did not. Poirot sat beside him. Would you say a person who poisons another is acting from fear, or anger? Usually both, said Hargrove, but more often fear. Fear of discovery. Fear of the victim's power. Poison is for cowards, Monsieur Poirot. Rarely a weapon of passion, almost always one of desperation. Then you think Rupert Glanville knew something worth killing for? Hargrove turned at last, his eyes cold. Don't you? Poirot inclined his head. I do. That evening, Poirot returned to Lucien Marching and requested once more to see his sketchbook. The Frenchman handed it over with a show of irritation. Still suspect me? He asked. I suspect everyone, monsieur, said Poirot. It is my nature. He turned the pages carefully. The drawing of the mask was still there. Precise, artistic, striking. But as Poirot flipped to the final page, he paused. It was a sketch of Rupert Glanville hunched at the library desk, a cup before him. You drew this from life? No, Lucien said. From memory, this afternoon. Curious, Poirot murmured, because this cup, he tapped, the sketch, is the Wedgwood Rupert preferred, not the plain white cup that killed him. Lucien blinked. I suppose I made an error. Poirot smiled faintly. Or perhaps, monsieur, your memory is more accurate than you intended. You saw Rupert with the Wedgwood cup. Would someone replaced it, didn't they? Marching stood. I've said enough. And yet, said Poirot softly, you have said precisely what I needed. That night Poirot and I sat before the fire in the green sitting room. The other guests had retired early, unnerved by the events of the day. Hastings, Poirot said, folding his hands, we are near the truth. The theft, the letter, and the murder, all are linked, but not by what has been done. By who feared it being discovered. I sipped my brandy. Do you think the killer believed Rupert had the mask? No, Poirot replied. They believed Rupert knew what the mask had been used for. That is the difference. The mask was not merely stolen, it was reawakened. He stared into the fire. There is something buried in this house's past, Hastings. Something tied to the seance in 1902. The mask is only the symbol. The secret is the true motive. I nodded slowly. But who would kill to keep a secret that old? Poirot looked at me, his expression grave. Someone for whom the past is not dead, but sleeping and very nearly exposed. The rain returned by dawn, a steady whispering veil that clung to the windows of Davenheim Manor like cold breath on glass. It was not a morning for walking or socializing. The guests, rattled now by both the theft and Rupert Glanville's death, remained largely in their rooms or loitered in the lounges in brittle silence. Only the chiming of clocks broke the hush. Each toll a subtle reminder of time's passage and its pressure. Poirot, however, was active from first light. I found him in the small morning parlor, carefully examining the broken shard of glass, recovered from the display case 2 days earlier. He wore his dressing gown still, but his hair was immaculately brushed, his mustaches precise. "You were up early," I remarked. "I could not sleep, Hastings," he said. "For the little gray cells. They were marching. They insisted something is amiss in what we have assumed." He held the shard up to the window light. "It broke after the mask was stolen, yet it was found in the cabinet, at the base. Tell me, Hastings, what does that suggest?" I considered. "It bets someone returned to the cabinet after the theft, exactement, and perhaps in that visit left something behind." At Poirot's instruction, Graves was summoned, and the two of us returned with him to the music room. Poirot gestured toward the open display cabinet. "Graves," he said, "this cabinet has not been disturbed since the theft." "None?" "No, sir, not to my knowledge." "Then kindly fetch the velvet lining from within." Graves did so, though with an expression of mild confusion. The blue velvet square, slightly rumpled, was removed and handed to Poirot, who spread it carefully across the piano lid. "Aha," he said suddenly. He pointed to a tiny hole, no larger than a pinhead, at the center of the fabric. "Here," he murmured, "and here." The thread pulled. "Observe, Hastings." I leaned closer. The velvet had indeed been pierced from the back. As if a fine needle had been pushed through, Poirot reached into his waistcoat pocket and removed the hair he had found days earlier. "It was not merely a thread caught by accident," he said. "It was part of a repair, swift makeshift. But telling someone used the mask to conceal something else, and in doing so they damaged the lining, however slightly." "Conceal something?" I echoed. "You mean ... a letter, a note, or," said Poirot softly, "a key." That afternoon, we met again with Vivian. She appeared pale, the lines at her eyes more pronounced than before, but her tone was calm. "You wished to speak to me, Monsieur Poirot?" "Yes, madame. I believe there is a drawer or compartment hidden within the cabinet that housed the mask, a place where something might be concealed." Vivian blinked. "I wasn't aware of any such drawer." Poirot stood. "May I show you?" Together we returned to the music room. Poirot gestured for Graves to bring a torch, and then knelt before the display case. With great care he pressed gently along the inner base of the cabinet's back wall. From the bottom panel a narrow drawer slid outward. It was shallow, no more than a half-inch deep. Inside there was nothing now, only dust, and a faint stain where something rectangular had once rested. Vivian stared. "I had no idea." "But someone did," said Poirot. "The mask's theft was not merely an act of greed. It was a cover, a distraction. Someone wanted access to what lay hidden here." Poirot spent the next hour poring through Davenheim's long-unused study, a cramped, dusty room filled with ledgers and family journals. I assisted, though my attention waned as we sifted through yellowing paper and brittle ink. "Here," Poirot said at last. He held up a slim, leather-bound book with a broken clasp. On the first page, written in an elegant 19th-century hand, was the inscription, "Property of Alonzo Foscar, January 1902. He turned to a bookmarked page and read aloud. "They but begged me not to use it. They called it theatrical, but the mask opened something in him." When Barnard began to speak in that voice, that strange, hollow voice, I knew we had gone too far. And then the candle extinguished itself, and he collapsed. They said it was his heart. I still hear it. I still see it. The mask looked ... Pleased. Poirot closed the book. "Barnard," he said softly. "That was the name Barnard who?" I asked. "I do not yet know, but this is the incident in Milan that Vivian's mother hinted at. It was no ordinary seance, and I believe it has come back to haunt this house." Just before dinner, Diana Harwood, hitherto quiet since Rupert's death, sought out. She appeared nervous, her eyes ringed with fatigue. "I think I may have made a mistake," she said quietly. Poirot nodded for her to go on. "I received something the day before Rupert died. Photograph, anonymous. It showed a group of people, seated around a table. Old, black and white, a seance, I think. At the bottom was scrawled, 'He died once, will he die again?' May I see it?" "I burned it," she said. "I didn't want anyone to find it." Poirot's expression did not change, but I saw the tension behind his stillness. "You knew Rupert was investigating the mask's past?" "Yes. He told me he traced something, a name. He said he was going to confront someone about it. Whom? I don't know, but he said the name was the key. That it was all in the name." Poirot was silent a long time. "I thank you, mademoiselle," he said at last. "This confirms something I have long suspected." That night, after the guests had retired, Poirot called for pen and paper and a floor plan of the house. He laid out the sketch across the table in our sitting room. "This," he said, "is the arrangement of the rooms at Davenheim. Now observe. The music room, the library, the south hall, and the portrait gallery." He drew a line from one to the next, then another, and another. "They form a circle," he said, "or, more precisely, a ring." "A ritual ring?" I asked, half joking, perhaps not a literal one, but the movement, the motion of those involved creates a pattern. I believe the events we are witnessing are not random. They follow something that was begun in 1902, something left incomplete. And the mask. Poirot tapped the center of the circle. The mask is the axis, the thing that binds the past and the present. Someone has tried to use it again or feared that another would. He stood abruptly. Hastings, tomorrow, we shall gather all the guests. It is time to apply pressure. The person responsible will crack. It was shortly before 11 o'clock the next morning when Hercule Poirot issued his summons. A note was placed discreetly in each guest's hand at breakfast. Written in Poirot's precise script made him et messieurs. I should be grateful if you would join me in the south parlor at 11:30. I believe it is time we spoke plainly. Hercule Poirot. The note caused a predictable flurry. Whispers passed along the breakfast table like a breeze, rustling dry leaves. Sir Barnaby scowled and muttered about theatrics. Diana Harwood read hers with blank composure. Cecilia Lavery rolled her eyes, but her hand trembled as she buttered her toast. Isabel Foscar looked as though she might be ill by the time the guests had assembled. The storm outside had resumed. The sky pressed low upon the windows, the wind moaned through the old stonework, and the atmosphere in the parlor was fraught with expectation. Poirot stood at the fireplace, flanked by the hearth's twin lion carvings. However, his faithful companion stood just to his right, observing the circle of strained faces before us. Vivian Foscar, seated stiffly at one end of the room, was silent. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. The others arranged themselves loosely on the settees and armchairs. Sir Barnaby, Miss Lavery, Dr. Hargrove, Lucien Marsham, the Risleys, Diana Harwood, and Isabel Graves, at Poirot's request, remained outside. Ms. Amos, Poirot began. You are all here because the events of the last few days, the theft of the Sapphire Mask, the death of Mr. Glanville, are not unrelated. They are, in fact, parts of the same story. There were murmurs, shifting postures. Poirot raised a hand. I shall not accuse anyone, not yet, but I will ask questions. Questions that have answers which someone here is determined not to give. He walked slowly to the center of the room. The mask, he said softly, was not taken out of greed, nor for mischief. It was taken to hide what lay behind it, a secret that has been buried for more than 2 decades. The trap is set. Turn toward Lucien Marsham. Monsieur, you claim to have drawn the mask from memory after it vanished, but your sketch showed a detail only visible from within the glass case. A defect in one of the sapphires. That detail, Monsieur Marsham, was not widely known. So either you lied about drawing from memory, or you saw the mask again after its disappearance. Marsham flushed. It's possible I exaggerated. I may have glanced at it again after it was taken. Poirot smiled, a delicate admission. But not the one I seek. He turned next to Cecilia Lavery. Mademoiselle, you said you entered the music room to play the piano, yet the keys bore no prints, the stool no disturbance. And you said you saw Lucien leaving, looking frightened. This too was false. Lucien did not leave first. You did, and you were carrying something hidden in your shawl. Lavery stiffened. I don't know what you mean. Poirot nodded. Very well. Let me ask you this. Was your fiancée's death truly an accident? A sharp intake of breath echoed from one corner of the room. You see, Poirot continued, I have read the accounts. Harold Northcliffe died in Amalfi under suspicious circumstances. He drowned, but only after drinking something that made him weak. You would never question, but now, I wonder, was the Sapphire Mask with you then? Vivian gasped. You think Cecilia had the mask in Italy? I think, said Poirot gravely, that the mask has traveled many places, and that its myth, its theatrical menace, is useful for those with secrets to keep. The second letter. Poirot reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded slip of paper. This was placed under my door last night. He read aloud, You will not understand until you see the whole thing. The truth lies beneath the lion's eyes. Look there, before it's too late. There was a long silence. Poirot's eyes scanned the room. The lion's eyes. What is beneath them? Then he turned sharply to Vivian Foscar. Madame, the hearth lions in this room, they are purely decorative. Yes, she blinked. Yes, they've been here since the house was built. Then you will not object to my removing one? Without waiting, Poirot crossed to the left lion carving and knelt beside it. He pressed at its base. Then, with a sudden click, the front portion of the statue slid aside to reveal a shallow cavity. Inside was a small velvet pouch. Poirot opened it slowly and withdrew a key, old, ornate, and unmistakably silver. The missing key, he said quietly, from the display cabinet's hidden drawer. He turned to the guests. It was hidden after the theft, which means someone here still feared what it would unlock. Not the mask, but the truth. Dr. Hargrove cracks it. Was Dr. Hargrove who spoke next, quietly, but with a tremor in his voice. There was a boy, he said, in the asylum. Years ago he kept speaking of a mask, of a ceremony. I never believed him. I thought it was delusion. Poirot turned slowly. Go on. His name was Bernard Lowell. Committed in 1902. Transferred from Milan after what the records called a psychotic break. He died in 1905. They said he starved himself. Poirot nodded slowly. Barnard, the same name written in Alonzo Foscar's journal. And you think this boy, this patient, was part of the séance? I asked. Poirot's voice was low. I think he was the one they used in the séance, the one who wore the mask. And I think something happened to him. Something that was never forgotten. The real target. Poirot turned back to the others. The theft was a distraction. Rupert Glanville, I believe, discovered the connection to Barnard. He found Alonso's letters, or pieces of them, and realized the mask's past was darker than a mere family legend. He confronted someone, and for that, he was silenced. He turned to Diana Harwood. "You received a photograph. You burned it, but it frightened you." "Yes," she whispered. "It felt threatening, as if someone was warning me not to dig." Poirot looked slowly around the room. "Someone here wanted the past to stay buried, but the past, Miss Amos, has claws." He stepped forward, voice quiet, controlled. "There is one among us who has lived under a false name, who was present in Milan, who saw Barnard's collapse, and who has tried to ensure no one else ever would." He paused. "Tomorrow, I shall reveal who that person is." And with that, Poirot gave a short bow, turned on his heel, and left the parlor, leaving behind a room as taut as a drawn wire. The morning after Poirot's dramatic declaration dawned with a deceptive calm. The storm had passed in the night, and golden light streamed through the mullioned windows of Davenheim Manor, casting a serene glow upon rooms still humming with unease. Yet, despite the sun, the mood among the guests was far from tranquil. There was no polite laughter over breakfast, no idle chit-chat. Instead, each person moved as though under observation, and indeed they were. Poirot's trap had been sprung, and now the suspects awaited its teeth. "Today," Hastings said as we walked through the corridor leading to the west wing, "we shall press upon the lies that have settled like dust in this house. One by one, I shall remove them. You believe someone here has assumed a false identity. Mais oui, and not recently. Years ago, they reinvented themselves. A new name, a new occupation, all to bury their connection to the events of 1902. But Rupert Glanville, curious and clever, found the link, and it cost him his life. The first encounter that morning came by accident. Maudie Risley, a frail woman with a perpetual look of worry, was seated in the upstairs gallery alone. Poirot stopped beside her. "You are far from the others, madame," she startled. "Oh, I needed air." Poirot smiled gently. "You and your husband, you seem nervous." She looked down. "Geoffrey has always hated gatherings. He's shy, doesn't like attention." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "But this is not simply shyness, is it? Your husband has not attended any of our recent conversations. He has barely spoken since we arrived." Maudie's voice dropped. "He's unwell. He has headaches. His memory is bad." "And what name did he go by before you married?" She froze. What? You met him in Milan, did you not? In 1920, at a hospital where he had no papers, where the staff referred to him only as the Englishman." She stood abruptly. "I need to go." But Poirot's voice was calm. "And certainly your husband is not Geoffrey Risley. He is someone else. He is the man who wore the sapphire mask." It took some coaxing and Vivian's quiet permission, but at last Poirot was permitted to speak with Geoffrey Risley alone in the small conservatory. The man who entered was a ghost of himself, pale, shivering slightly despite the warm sun beyond the windows. He looked, for the first time, like someone hiding from his own reflection. "I know," he said softly, before Poirot could speak. "I know who I was." "Then you remember?" He nodded. "Fragments, only fragments, only fragments. For years, it was a void. I was found in the streets in Milan, raving. I had no papers, no memory, but in time, things came back. The mask, the seance, the boy." Barnard Poirot leaned in. "You are Alistair Bennet." Risley closed his eyes. "Yes, I was a friend of Alonso Fosca. I studied theater. I was meant to be a dramatist, a man of ideas. Alonso wanted to push boundaries. Seances as performance art. He called them. The mask was his centerpiece. He said it would bring something out of the subconscious, that it would awaken truths, and it did." Risley shivered. "Barnard was only a boy, a cousin of one of Alonso's Italian patrons. He was gifted, clairaudient, they said, sensitive. The seance was a show, but it turned into something else. He changed when he wore the mask. He spoke in voices, said things no one should know. Then he collapsed, and I ran." Poirot's tone was gentle. "You were never the same. I couldn't forget his face. I dreamt it over and over, so I disappeared. I became Geoffrey. Maudie helped me. She never asked questions. But Rupert, he recognized a photograph. He cornered me 2 days ago. Said he knew who I was, said the mask was evil. I begged him to say nothing. You did not kill him." "No." Riz eyes widened. "I would never I swear to you." Poirot studied him. "I believe you." That afternoon, Poirot received a surprise. Graves the butler knocked on his door with a velvet pouch. "This was found," he said, "inside the candelabra in the portrait gallery. One of the maids was dusting. It must have been placed there recently." Inside was a second key identical to the first, but with a tiny engraved numeral too. "Another key," I said. "To what?" Poirot turned it over in his hands. "To the second drawer," he murmured. We returned to the display cabinet in the music room. Beneath the velveted compartment where the first drawer had slid free was another groove, invisible unless one knew precisely where to feel. With delicate care, Poirot inserted the second key. Click. The drawer revealed itself thinner, narrower than the first. Inside was a single folded page, yellowed and fragile. Poirot unfolded it. On the paper was written, in elegant script, "To whomever finds this, know that we acted out of arrogance." We thought we could summon truth, but all we summoned was guilt. The mask contains nothing and everything. I give it up now, before it consumes me too. Forgive us, A.F. Alonso Foscar's final note, I breathed. Poirot nodded slowly. He knew, he saw what they had done, and he tried, at the end, to stop the legacy from spreading. That evening Poirot called a private meeting with Vivienne Foscar. She was seated in the library, hands clenched in her lap. You have hidden much, madame, he said quietly. You knew Geoffrey Risley's identity. You knew the story of the mask. She was silent a moment, then nodded. My mother told me everything before she died, she said. About Alonso, about the seance, about Barnard's death. She swore me to silence. Then, why did you bring these people here? Her expression was strained. Because I wanted it to end. I thought if the truth came out, if the circle will complete, the mask would lose its power. Instead, Poirot said gently, someone used your intentions for their own end. She looked up sharply. You know who I do, he said, and tomorrow, I will tell you all. The drawing room was silent. Outside, the rain had returned, falling in fine, steady threads that blurred the garden paths and streaked the windows like tears. It was 6:30 in the evening when Poirot requested that all remaining guests assemble in the long drawing room, the very chamber where the portrait of Alonso Foscar still hung, staring out with theatrical pride from a canvas darkened by time. Vivienne Foscar stood by the hearth, arms folded tightly. The rest sat or loitered in various states of unease. Geoffrey Risley, now fully exposed as Alistair Bennet, sat hunched and pale in a wing-back chair. Cecilia Lavery appeared defiant but distracted. Sir Barnaby glowered. Diana Harwood looked drawn. Dr. Hargrove, cool as ever, kept his arms folded as if studying a lecture hall. Isabel stood in the corner, silent as a ghost. Poirot took his place before them all, his small frame composed, his green eyes glittering with clarity. He looked, as he so often did at such moments, as though the world had already confessed its secrets to him, and now he had only to recite them. Mies Imis, he began, I thank you for your patience. I know it has not been easy. You have been trapped in this house with suspicion and death, and all under the long shadow of a mask that no one understands, and yet everyone fears. He paced slowly. It is time, now that I tell you the truth. He turned toward Vivienne Foscar. You inherited more than a house, madame. You inherited a legacy built on secrecy, on performance and illusion, but also, I believe, on regret. Vivienne's lips parted slightly. She said nothing. Poirot continued. Now turning toward the group, Alonso Foscar and his circle sought to create something theatrical, spiritual, and psychological. A seance as drama, bold, yes, arrogant, absolutely. But something went terribly wrong. A young boy, Barnard Lowell, was used as a centerpiece. He wore the mask, and whether it was suggestion, trauma, or something less explainable, the experience shattered his mind. Poirot gestured to Geoffrey Risley. This man once known as Alistair Bennet was there. He saw the collapse. He fled, remade his life, and buried his past. Geoffrey's head dropped, and so the mask was locked away. Until, that is, Rupert Glanville began to uncover the truth. He traced the name Barnard, he found records, he recognized Bennet, and realized what the Foscar family had hidden. Poirot paused. And that, he said softly, is why he was murdered. Gasps rippled across the room. Diana Harwood took a step backward. Cecilia Lavery rose halfway from her seat. Poirot raised a hand. Rupert was killed with cyanide. Introduced not through the tea tray, but the cup, a plain white cup, substituted deliberately for the Wedgwood he always preferred. A switch that required opportunity, and intimate access to the family's china. He turned slowly. Only one person here handled the service that day. Only one knew precisely which cup Rupert would not question. He looked at the butler. Not you, Graves, though you prepared the tray. No, it was someone who rearranged the tray after you left it outside the library. Poirot's eyes settled on Dr. Elias Hargrove. You poisoned Rupert Glanville. A stunned silence. Then Hargrove gave a single, dry laugh. You're quite clever, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot nodded. I try. Vivienne stepped forward, eyes blazing. Why? She demanded. Why would you do such a thing? Hargrove's mask of civility slipped for the briefest moment, revealing something bitter and calculating beneath. Because Rupert had gone too far, he said. He found letters, records, and eventually a document that named me from Milan. I was there, not just as an observer. I was the attending physician at the asylum where Barnard died. Poirot nodded. He starved himself, the records say. But that wasn't the whole truth, was it? No, said Hargrove. Barnard was mad. Dangerous. He'd become obsessed with the mask, with what he'd seen. I tried to treat him. I failed. And when he died, Alonso Foscar wrote to me begging me to destroy the records. I agreed, but some survived. Rupert found them and threatened to expose you. He said he'd publish a book. Hargrove spat. A sensationalist bit of drivel tying me to seances, trauma, malpractice, even cultism. It would have destroyed me, my career, my reputation, all gone because of a mad boy's hallucinations and a cursed bit of enamel. He folded his arms. So yes, I acted, but I do not regret it. Poirot's voice was soft, and the mask, I don't care about the mask, Hargrove snapped. I care about order, reason. If it had stayed locked away, none of this would have happened. And yet Poirot said, "You're wrong." Hargrove blinked. Poirot turned to Vivian. "You never intended to expose the mask, did you?" Vivian shook her head slowly. "No. I invited you all here because someone sent me a message, a warning that someone would try to use the mask again, that someone would die." Poirot drew from his pocket the first anonymous note he had received. "I believe, madam, that the same person who warned you also warned me. Someone who feared the mask's reawakening, not for its legend, but for the truth it might stir." He turned back to the room. "That person is here, and they know where the mask is now." A silence fell. Then, from the corner, Isabel stepped forward. "I have it," she whispered. "I took it after Rupert died. I was afraid I didn't want anyone else to wear it." Poirot's gaze softened. "You did well, mademoiselle. You feared its power, and you were right to do so." He turned to Vivian. "Let it be destroyed, not for superstition but for mercy." Vivian nodded slowly. "Yes." That night, the police arrived to take Dr. Hargrove into custody. Poirot gave a statement, precise and calm. The others gave theirs, to some with shame, some with relief. We retired to the sitting room after they had gone. The storm had passed again, and the house had finally begun to exhale, I must say. "Poirot," I remarked, "this case was unlike any other. The mask, the seance, the boy." Poirot stirred his tisane. "Ah, Hastings. It was not truly about the mask, it was about guilt, the kind that festers in silence, the kind that changes a man's name, or drives another to kill." He set down his cup, but in the end, the little grey cells, they prevailed, as they must. The sun returned the next morning, reluctant and pale, casting long slats of light across the stone-flagged terrace and bathing the ivy-covered walls of Davenheim Manor in a golden hush. The storm had passed at last, but its presence still lingered. In the minds of every guest, no one spoke of breakfast that day. The dining table was half abandoned, the coffee gone cold. All eyes and thoughts were trained upon the sitting room, where Hercule Poirot had promised to gather everyone once more, to say, finally and without ambiguity, what had really happened. At 11 o'clock sharp, Poirot entered. He was dressed immaculately, as always, a grey morning suit, his mustaches trimmed to perfection, his expression composed. I followed behind, notebook in hand, though I knew I would scarcely need it. Once Poirot began, the truth would roll forward with the force of certainty. The room was hushed as we entered. Vivian Foscar stood by the fireplace, her bearing proud but subdued. Geoffrey Risley, or rather, Alistair Bennet, remained in his chair, still absorbing the collapse of the identity he had guarded for decades. Isabel hovered at his side, pale but resolute. Sir Barnaby Trent had returned from a walk, his boots still damp from the grass. Diana Harwood sat by the window, her expression unreadable. Cecilia Lavery was draped across a settee, smoking languidly, but her eyes were sharp, and Lucien Marchand was sketching something absently in the margin of his notebook, feigning detachment. Poirot stepped into the center of the room and cleared his throat. Silence fell instantly. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said. "At last, the facts. This case," Poirot said, "began with a theft. A mask, the Sapphire Mask, vanishes from its locked display case. A singular object, and one with a reputation. But as you all now realize, it was not the object that truly mattered. It was what it represented." He paced slowly. The mask was the key to a legacy, a secret passed down, whispered, feared, a séance gone wrong in 1902. A boy, Barnard Lowell, left broken. A man, Mr. Alistair Bennet, fled the country in his name. And a physician, Dr. Elias Hargrove, who helped cover it up. He turned to each of them in turn. Rupert Glanville, a journalist, followed the trail. He uncovered names, connections, records, long buried. He confronted Bennet, then hinted to Diana Harwood that he would go public, and that Ms. Amos is when Dr. Hargrove acted. He pointed gently. He poisoned Rupert, not in haste but with planning cyanide in the cup, a false teacup swapped in while the tray sat alone in the hall, a gesture of control from a man accustomed to precision. Dr. Hargrove, seated at the edge of the room, said nothing. His expression was fixed, more tired than defiant. "And yet," Poirot continued, "that is not the whole of it, because while Hargrove killed to protect himself, someone else, someone among you, set events in motion." He turned to Vivian Foscar. "Madame, you invited these guests. You said you were warned." Vivian nodded once, her chin lifted. "I was sent a letter. Weeks before the gathering." Poirot held up a folded page. "A letter in your mother's handwriting. She died 5 years ago. And yet this letter warning you to protect the mask is dated this year." Vivian paled. "I don't understand." Poirot's voice dropped. "Someone forged it. Someone who knew the handwriting well. Someone who wanted you to gather all those connected to the past." He turned and pointed to Cecilia Lavery. "You wrote that letter." Gasps rippled across the room. Poirot advanced, voice soft but iron-edged. "You, mademoiselle, were close to the Foscar family. You were once engaged to Harold Northcliffe, whose drowning you never truly explained. You were in Milan in 1902 as a child, visiting an aunt. You saw the séance." Cecilia scoffed. I was 8. Children remember what adults forget. You carried that image with you. And when you learned that Rupert Glanville had found a link between your family and the seance, you feared he would name you too as part of the legacy. He paused. He did not kill Rupert. But you manipulated Vivian. You sent the forged letter to draw everyone together, hoping the tension would silence the past. And when the mask vanished, you feared it had come back to destroy you. Cecilia's smile vanished. She looked away. You have no proof. No. Poirot lifted the small scrap of paper from his pocket. Then explain why your ink, a specific blend used in theatrical calligraphy, matches that of the forged note, or why your personal stationery, embossed in Florence, bears the same watermark as the letter to Vivian. She stood slowly, then slumped back into her seat, while she said, "Perhaps I hoped a little pressure would keep people quiet. Is that so terrible?" "No," said Poirot, "but it is foolish. For secrets, mademoiselle, are never silenced, only delayed." Poirot turned now to the wider group. "The mask was found by Isabelle Foscar after Rupert's death. She hid it, rightly afraid. But it is not the mask that cursed you, Miss Amos. It is the silence you all chose. Silence about a seance that broke a boy. Silence about a death. Silence about fear." He folded his hands. "That silence has now been shattered." He turned to Vivian. "Burn the mask. Not as superstition, but as closure." Vivian nodded. "I will." That afternoon, Poirot and I prepared to leave Davenheim. Our cases were packed. Our carriage ordered. The house stood calmer than it had in days. On the steps, Isabelle met us with a small parcel. "It's the last letter from Alonso," she said. "My mother hid it in a drawer. It's dated just days after Barnard's death." Poirot opened it and read in silence. Then he folded it carefully. "Mercy, mademoiselle. There are ghosts in this house, but fewer than before." She smiled faintly. "Goodbye, Monsieur Poirot." And as the carriage pulled away down the long drive, I glanced back at the great stone manor, its windows glinting in the afternoon sun, and felt, for the first time in days, that the house had begun to breathe again. We had scarcely been back in London 24 hours when Hercule Poirot, to my surprise, suggested a quiet evening at home. No dinner engagements, no visits to Scotland Yard, and no rearrangement of his ever-growing collection of silk walking sticks. He merely sat by the fire in his favorite armchair at Whitehaven Mansions, sipping his tisane and gazing out the window into the dusk, where the lamps of the city were beginning to bloom like soft golden flowers in the fog. I, for my part, was still absorbing the whirlwind events of the past week, the theft, the death, the long-hidden secret that had festered beneath the theatrical surface of Davenheim Manor. I sat across from him, a whiskey in hand, uncertain whether to break the comfortable silence. It was Poirot who spoke first. "You are pensive tonight, mon ami." "I suppose I'm still thinking about the mask," I said. "And the people Hargrove, Cecilia Lavery, even poor Risley, or Bennet rather." Poirot nodded slowly. "It was a case of roles. Hastings' roles adopted, abandoned, resurrected, and the mask, how apt, nest cepa, a literal symbol for what each person tried to hide. I never believed in its curse, of course," I said, trying to sound firm. Poirot gave a small smile. "And yet you felt it. The atmosphere, the unease. That, Hastings, is the power of suggestion. The human mind, when confronted with the unknown, looks not to logic but to fear." He turned to me, hands clasped before him. "It is easy to think this case was about mysticism, superstition, or performance, but at its core, it was a case of guilt. What we saw at Davenheim was a kind of theater, yes, each guest playing a role. The grieving cousin, the discreet diplomat, the fading actress, the faithful butler. But theater, mon ami, is never real, and when the curtains part, the truth steps into the light." He took another sip of tisane. "Rupert Glanville was no saint," Poirot continued. "He was an opportunist, a scavenger of secrets. But even scavengers sometimes strike gold. He stumbled upon something the others had buried, something they believed the world would never find. That was his sin, and that is why he died." "Do you believe Hargrove regrets it?" I asked. Poirot gave a small shrug. "He regrets being caught. Perhaps with time he will regret the act. But he is a man who built his career on control. When that control slipped, when the ghost of a boy he failed came knocking, he chose silence. With poison." I hesitated before asking, "And what about the mask? Do you believe, as some of them did, that it held power?" Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. Then he smiled. "Nan Hastings, the mask held no power, no spirit, no curse. It was an object. A beautiful, troubling object, yes, but one made of enamel and gemstone. Its power was what people gave it. Superstition is the child of fear, and fear is the parent of irrationality." He paused, thoughtful, but the mask did do one thing. It revealed. Not because it acted, but because it forced others to. Its presence drew secrets into the open. And in the end, that is what matters. Just then, the bell rang. Poirot raised a brow as I fetched the envelope from the doorman. It was addressed in a careful hand, and bore the Davenheim crest in blue wax. Poirot opened it carefully and read aloud. "Dear Monsieur Poirot, the mask has been destroyed, as you advised. The key was melted. The cabinet, too, has been dismantled. We shall not keep symbols of silence in this house any longer. Geoffrey, or Alistair, has gone to stay with relatives in Sussex. He says he is ready to face what remains of his life, honestly. As for me, I will remain at Davenheim for now. The ghosts have grown quieter. Thank you. Vivian Fosca Poirot folded the letter with delicate precision. Good, he said quietly. That is as it should be. As night deepened and the fire crackled low, Poirot remained lost in thought. These cases, Hastings, they are not only puzzles of logic, they are tapestries. Each thread, each lie, each hesitation, all are woven together. It is not merely the mind one must read, it is the soul. He stood, stretched lightly, and looked out toward the street below. I think, Mon ami, he said at last, we shall rest for a while. This one has left the taste of ashes. But you solved it, I said. He nodded. Yes, but solving a case does not always bring joy. Sometimes it only brings light. And with that, Hercule Poirot turned away from the window, snuffed the last lamp, and stepped into the quiet shadows of the room, leaving behind the memory of a mask that had seen too much, and a mystery that had asked not just who, but why. It was 2 weeks after our return from Davenheim that the case, so we thought, concluded, resurfaced with quiet insistence. Poirot had resumed his habitual schedule, orderly breakfasts, precisely timed walks, and afternoons devoted to correspondence. I myself had returned to the gentler rhythms of London life, though I admit I often found myself reliving our days in Kent, the quiet menace of the manor, the secrets behind every smile, the eerie presence of the mask. On a particularly clear Tuesday morning, as I read the Times, Poirot entered our shared sitting room with a letter held aloft between 2 fingers, as though it was something toxic. My dear Hastings, he said, I have received a most singular communication. From whom? That, Poirot said, is not immediately clear. He handed me the letter. The envelope was pale, violet, sealed with a pressed sprig of lavender. The paper inside was scented, and the ink was a striking shade of deep plum. It read, Monsieur Poirot, you removed the mask, but not the veil. There are truths that even you have not uncovered. Come to Thornleigh on the 28th. Do not delay. A second death is coming. A friend to Barnard. I looked up. Or a tie. Second death. Poirot nodded gravely. And the signature, a friend to Barnard. That, Hastings, is what intrigues me most. Poirot sat at the window, tapping the envelope gently against his palm. You see, Hastings, we believed the matter at Davenheim to be closed. Dr. Hargrove exposed, the Sapphire Mask destroyed, and yet this letter implies that the story isn't over. Just so, and note the careful wording, you removed the mask, but not the veil. A metaphor, perhaps, but one that suggests something more was hidden than even I perceived. I frowned. Do you think it's genuine, a warning, or a trap? Poirot was silent a moment. It may be neither. It may be a plea, or a confession. He looked down at the signature again. A friend to Barnard. You believe someone else was there that night in Milan? Possibly, or someone who knew Barnard afterwards. At the asylum, perhaps, someone with reason to believe he was wronged, and that his story was never fully told. Poirot stood suddenly decisive. Hastings, we are going to Thornleigh. We took the train to Sussex 2 days later, following a telegram sent to an address listed beneath the lavender seal, a secluded cottage called Elderbank, nestled just beyond the village of Thornleigh. The journey was uneventful, the air crisp and fresh, the landscape beginning to show signs of autumn's gold. The house itself was a modest, ivy-clad cottage with leaded windows and a slate roof. We were met not by a maid or housekeeper, but by a woman tall, pale, in her 60s, with severe features and deeply set eyes. She introduced herself simply. My name is Agnes Crale. Poirot inclined his head. It is you who wrote the letter, madame. I did, she replied. Please come in. We haven't much time. Inside, the cottage was immaculately clean, but oddly devoid of warmth. The sitting room held no family photographs, no clutter, only a single painting of a boy in a blue school uniform. Poirot's eyes were drawn to it at once. That is Barnard Lowell, said Agnes Crale. He was my nephew. We sat, and Agnes began to speak. Barnard came to live with us when he was 9. His parents were distant cousins of the Foscar family. Lesser blood, he was strange, gifted perhaps, but troubled. He heard things, saw things, and Alonzo Foscar took an interest in him. She looked down. They called it an experiment, a séance, a theatrical gesture. They made him wear the mask, and something happened to him that night. He was never the same. Poirot listened in perfect stillness. They institutionalized him. Said he was dangerous, but I visited every week, and Barnard, he wrote things, he drew things. Always the same shape, a circle of 12 stars. Always the mask, and once, just once, he wrote a name. Poirot's voice was soft. Whose name? Agnes stood and returned with a box. Inside, carefully preserved, were Barnard's notebooks filled with disjointed scrawls, ink blots, and haunting drawings. She flipped to a page and held it up. In the center was the image of the mask, surrounded by a ring of stars. Beneath it, she watched, she laughed, she lit the candle. Poirot leaned in. Agnes nodded. He never said who, but he repeated it, over and over, that she was the one who made him wear it, that she called the spirit. Poirot closed the notebook. "Gently, Hastings," he said. "I believe we have made an error. The wrong person has borne the guilt." That night, in our small inn overlooking the fields beyond Thorn, Poirot sat in deep reflection. "I had assumed," he said, "that Alonzo Foscar orchestrated the sentence, that Hargrove facilitated it, and that the others were merely present. But Barnard's words suggest otherwise. You think a woman was responsible, someone influential, someone who had reason to want the experiment performed." He held up Barnard's notebook once more. She watched. She laughed. She lit the candle. Poirot looked at me. "There is one person we never truly questioned, Hastings, not because she was guilty of murder, but because we assumed her grief was real. Vivienne Foscar." Poirot shook his head. "No, Isabel." I stared at him. "Isabel, but she's barely said a word." "Precisely," Poirot said. "She has kept herself invisible. But the veil, Hastings, the veil remains." He stood. "We are going back to Davenheim." We arrived at Davenheim Manor on a chill October morning, the landscape subdued beneath a gauze of drifting mist. The manor loomed above the hedgerows like a watching figure, unchanged from our previous visit, and yet, to my eyes, entirely transformed. The silence seemed deeper, more personal. The facade was no longer merely stone and ivy. It was memory, bound tight and unspoken. Vivienne Foscar received us in the south drawing-room. Her manner was brisk but not unwelcome. There were no longer guests wandering the halls, no distant footsteps or hushed conspiracies behind velvet curtains. Only the staff remained. "And Isabel, she's upstairs," Vivienne said. "She hardly leaves her room these days." "She's been unwell," Poirot nodded. "I must speak with her alone." Vivienne hesitated, her voice softer now. "Isabel has always been fragile. You don't think?" Poirot's gaze was unreadable. "Madame, I think many things. But I promise it shall not harm her. My concern is for the truth, nothing more." The pale girl Isabel received us in the east-facing morning room, seated in a high-backed chair beside a bay window. She wore grey wool and a faded shawl. Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, trembled almost imperceptibly when Poirot entered. She looked up at once and did not look away. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, very quietly, "I wondered if you would return, did you, mademoiselle?" he asked gently, taking a seat. "Then perhaps you knew we had not found the whole truth." She closed her eyes. "No one ever does." "Then let us begin again," he said. "This time, with no masks, no pretense, only truth." The girl in the shadows. Poirot's tone was warm but firm. "Barnard Lowell, you remember him?" "Yes," she whispered. "He was my cousin. You were at Davenheim the summer of 1902. You were 8 years old." She nodded. "Tell me about the seance." She hesitated. "I wasn't supposed to be there. It was late. They thought I was asleep. But I had a habit of wandering the halls listening. I liked secrets." Poirot said nothing. I watched through the door. Alonzo was laughing. He was drinking. The others were chanting or pretending to. It was all theater, except Barnard. He wasn't pretending. He was afraid. And the mask, they made him wear it at first. He cried. Then he stopped, and then her voice trembled. He started saying things, terrible things about the people in the room, their sins, their desires. And when he looked at me, I was still hiding. He said one word. She looked at Poirot, eyes brimming. She lit the candle. Poirot leaned forward softly. "You lit the candle?" She nodded. "I did. I snuck in before the seance began. Alonzo always kept a black candle for his rituals, I thought. I thought it would be fun. A joke. I was a child. But that candle, it was meant for real ceremonies, not theater." She buried her face in her hands. "I didn't understand. Barnard saw me. And I think something entered the room. Or left. I don't know. But after that night, nothing was ever right again." The veil falls. Poirot stood slowly. "Then the veil, mademoiselle, it was not over the mask. It was over your own memory, your own guilt." She nodded. "And Rupert Glanville?" he asked gently. "I didn't kill him," she said, "but I believe he knew. He had found a photograph of the seance. I saw him staring at it. My shadow was visible in the corner. He asked me once if I remembered anything. I lied." Poirot was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Your cousin died in an asylum, and you have been trapped in one of your own." She gave a sad smile. "Yes." A final confession as we descended the staircase. Vivienne intercepted us, her face tight with worry. "Well," she demanded. Poirot's reply was measured. "Your cousin was there the night the mask was used." She lit the ceremonial candle, not knowing what it meant. Vivienne exhaled sharply. "My God. But she did not kill Rupert Glanville, nor did she take the mask. Her only crime was silence, born of guilt." Vivienne looked away, her voice thin. "So much suffering. All because of that one night." "No," Poirot said gently. "Because no one had the courage to speak of it." "The photograph." As we prepared to leave, Poirot asked one final question. "May I see the photograph Rupert discovered?" Vivienne nodded. "He left it with me. I didn't know what to do with it." She fetched it from a desk drawer, a faded sepia image of a circle of people seated around a table. There was Alonzo Foscar, eyes wild with theatrical fervor. Hargrove, looking impossibly young. Cecilia Lavery's mother, her hand resting on a wineglass. And in the corner, a sliver of shadow, a child's face half hidden behind the doorframe. Poirot studied it for a long time. Then he folded the photograph and placed it gently in his breast pocket. Some truths, he said, require no public reckoning, only peace. Departure. As our car pulled away from Davenheim for the second and final time, I looked over at Poirot. Will you tell the authorities about Isabel? He shook his head. There is no crime to prosecute Hastings, no justice to demand. She carries her sentence already in memory. He leaned back in his seat. This case, it was not about murder alone. It was about what people choose to remember, and what they choose to forget. He closed his eyes, and for once, fell into silence. London, 3 days later. That it was a grey, long afternoon when the envelope arrived. Cream paper, no return address, sealed with a thick blot of green wax. Poirot received it with an unreadable expression and opened it at the breakfast table with the utmost care. I had just buttered my toast and was halfway through the Daily Mail when he gave a soft, short exclamation. A bean, he murmured. It seems our tale has one last epilogue. I set my paper down. From whom? An anonymous correspondent, though not unfamiliar. Observe. He passed me the letter. The same handwriting as before, the lavender ink from chapter 12, but now its lines were more fluid, almost poetic. It read, Monsieur Poirot, you have opened all the boxes, shown all the masks, but you left one unopened. The letter Rupert never showed. He received it before Davenheim, the original letter, the one that drew him back into the matter. You will find it in the reading room of the Claremont Club, hidden behind a copy of The Hollow Man, third shelf, spine loose. Read it, then decide. Have you solved everything? A watcher. Poirot placed the letter gently beside his cup. It appears, Hastings, that even in the ashes, an ember may glow. The Claremont Club was one of those narrow wood-paneled reading clubs of Mayfair, deeply respectable, faintly dusty, and always eerily quiet. Poirot, being something of an honorary member due to past investigations, was granted access with no objection. The reading room was on the second floor. Tall shelves, velvet chairs, brass sconces, and that peculiar stillness only found among unread first editions and the scent of old paper. It took him but a moment to find The Hollow Man, Carr's Lockroom classic, and, behind it, the envelope wedged inside the empty backing of the shelf. Poirot opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once, a letter. Typed, Dear Mr. Glanville, you were right to inquire. The séance in Milan was no theater. It was an experiment, not by Alonso Foscar but by someone more dangerous. I was there. I saw how they chose the boy, how they whispered into his ear that he was special, how they made him believe. The woman in grey lit the candle. The man in the blue robe held the book, but the mask was mine. I gave it to Alonso Foscar. I made it, and I have regretted it ever since. You may call me M, but you will not find me M. Poirot, read it 3 times. Then he folded it carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and slipped it into his coat pocket. Well, I said, trying not to sound too impatient. What does it mean? Poirot smiled faintly. It means, Hastings, that there is always another layer. Back at Whitehaven, Poirot laid the letter out beside his case notes. He arranged them in careful rows: photographs, statements, floor plans, timelines, a paper reconstruction of Davenheim and the lives it had distorted. This letter, he said, was written by someone who was not merely present, but instrumental. The mask, it seems, was no antique. It was designed by EMW, and that changes everything. He paced slowly. Until now we believed the mask to be a relic, old, mystical, imbued with tragic power. But now we see it as something deliberately crafted for a purpose, a man-made object, built for psychological effect. You think it was part of the séance to manipulate the boy? Poirot nodded. Barnard was chosen because of his sensitivity. The mask was designed to isolate him, amplify fear, distort voice and vision. It was theater, but theater used to provoke true breakdown. Someone created it knowing what it would do, and that someone was never named. Poirot looked out the window. Except as M, a letter, a veil. He paused. But I suspect I know who it was. Poirot retrieved his notes on Cecilia Lang. He tapped a highlighted passage. She studied under a theatrical designer in Paris, a man known for psychological costumes, an obscure figure. Stage name, Martinel. Poirot smiled. Martinel. M.I. blinked. You think he created the mask? I do. And I believe he sent Rupert this letter, not to warn him, but to confess. At the end of his life, perhaps Martinel wished to unburden himself. Then he was the true originator of the mask's power. But he did not kill Rupert. He built the theater and others played the roles. He died years ago, but his creation outlived him. Poirot placed the letter in his file. The curse of the Sapphire Mask, Hastings, was not supernatural. It was human, created by art, fueled by guilt, and fed by silence. That night we sat by the fire once more, the city quiet beyond the window. You're not, said I, still feel haunted, not by ghosts, by what people are willing to do in silence. Poirot nodded. Silence is the most dangerous mask of all. He tapped the side of his head. But the little grey cells, Hastings, they pierce all disguises. Then, for once, he leaned back in his chair and let the silence fall, not as a mask but as peace. The days passed quietly after the final letter. There were no more anonymous notes, no lingering footsteps in the dark, no whispers from the past calling out to be answered, but the case, La Tragédie de la Masque de Sapphire, as Poirot once called it, did not loosen its hold easily, not on him. And not on me. Poirot spent several mornings refining his case notes for his personal archives. No publication, of course. He had never cared for glory, only order. And the Sapphire Mask affair, more than any in recent memory, had touched something deeper in him, something human, and quietly sorrowful. One afternoon I returned from errands to find him seated at his desk, hands tented beneath his chin, gazing not at papers or maps, but at a small item laid delicately on velvet before him. It was Isabelle Foscar's locket, a simple silver oval with no engravings. "You've kept it?" I asked. "She sent it to me this morning," he replied, not lifting his gaze, "with a letter." I waited as he unfolded it and read aloud, "Monsieur Poirot, thank you for not naming me, for not turning memory into spectacle. I lit the candle that night, but I was not the one who watched Barnard suffer. There were others, adults, capable of stopping it. They didn't. You reminded me that guilt does not equal blame. I have gone to Italy. I want to visit the asylum where Barnard died, not for penance, for peace. Yours gratefully, Isabelle Foscar." Poirot folded the letter and placed it beside the locket. "She was never the architect of pain, Hastings," he said softly, "but she carried the weight of it, as many do." A week later Poirot received another visitor, Vivienne Foscar herself. She arrived without entourage, dressed in mourning grey, her dark hair veiled, her face calm. She brought no suitcase, only a folder. Inside, the deed to Davenheim Manor, a solicitor's letter, a photograph of the mask, burning in the fireplace. "It's done," she said, setting it all before "The house has been left to the National Trust. I've moved to my apartment in London." Poirot nodded. "A difficult choice, a necessary one. I can't keep rooms filled with secrets, with ghosts." She studied him. "Tell me the truth, Monsieur Poirot. Did you know everything, even at the beginning?" He hesitated only a moment. "No," he said, "not everything, but I knew that the theft was a signal, that the past had risen again." She gave a sad smile. "My mother used to say we Foscars were all performers even when no one was watching." Poirot met her eyes. "Madame," he said gently, "when no one is watching, that is when the true performance begins." That evening Poirot asked me to walk with him. A rare request. We strolled through Green Park, the leaves turning amber and brittle beneath our shoes. The light was honeyed and low, casting long shadows on the gravel path. "You feel it is over?" I asked. Poirot gave a short nod. "Yes, the threads are tied, the players revealed, and the mask gone. But something remains," I said, watching him. "You're troubled still?" "Not troubled," he replied, reflective. "This case, Hastings, it was not about genius. It was about pain. Hidden, denied, then unleashed. Pain turns to silence, and silence turns to myth. And myth, when left unchecked, becomes power." He glanced at me, his tone quiet as still. "I solve crimes, but I cannot undo sorrow." "No," I said, "but you gave it a voice. That counts." He was silent a long time. Then, "Yes, that must count." Back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot took one last glance at the folder from Davenheim before locking it into his archive drawer. Between the affair at the Vernet Theatre and the mystery of Madame Celeste, "Let the past sleep, Hastings," he said. "But," I asked, "what if it wakes again?" Poirot gave a small smile. "Then we shall be ready, mon ami." It was on a mild November morning, the air crisp but not cold. The leaves gathered in cheerful heaps beneath wrought iron fences that I realized the mystery of the Sapphire Mask had changed something in Hercule Poirot, not in his methods. Those remained as immaculate and precise as ever. Not in his appearance, his moustaches still shone with wax brilliance, but in something subtler. The silence between his words had deepened. We were sitting together in his study at Whitehaven Mansions. He had been unusually still that morning, staring not at his beloved charts or scrapbooks, but at a single object that now lay on the desk before him. A photograph, the one Rupert Glanville had unearthed, the séance in Milan. He had it, cleaned, restored. It was now framed in simple walnut, unadorned. "You still keep it?" I remarked. He nodded. It is important to remember what harm the living may do, even with the best of intentions." I studied the image again. There was the circle of adults, Alonzo Foscar, theatrical, Hargrove, youthful, a blur of others in candlelight, and in the shadowed edge a small girl watching. Isabel. "And yet," I said quietly, "you let her go." "She was never meant to stay," Poirot said, "not in punishment. She punished herself for years." At 10:30, the post arrived. One envelope unmarked, inside a clipping from an Italian newspaper. A photograph showed Isabelle Foscar standing beside a gravestone marked simply Barnard Lowell, 1891 to 1905. The article was in Italian. Poirot translated it aloud. "English woman visits grave of forgotten asylum child, brings flowers, silence, and a letter sealed in wax below, a second note in English. He is remembered now. That is enough." If Poirot said nothing for a moment. Then he rose, walked to the fireplace, and placed the photograph, Rupert's face, down in the drawer. his story is over. That afternoon, we lunched at Simpson's Inn. Poirot ordered roast beef, unusually indulgent, and even allowed a second glass of claret. He spoke little of the case, but he smiled more than usual, nodding often, humming faintly under his breath. As we departed, he paused on the pavement and looked up at the sky. "It is strange, Hastings," he said, "to think that such darkness, who was born from a thing as small as a mask." "And yet," I replied, "you always say the smallest thing reveals the greatest truth." He gave a satisfied nod. "Ah, yes, the truth, Hastings, it is like a flame. It flickers, it hides, but in the end, it endures." In the weeks that followed, the events at Davenheim faded from public memory. Rupert Glanville's death was declared a personal tragedy. The estate's transition to the National Trust noted politely in the Times. No mention was made of seances, of curses, of masks, but in the private archives of Hercule Poirot, the case was marked with a rare footnote: resolved not through deduction alone, but through compassion. Memory, not murder, was the final adversary. And when, years later, I passed by Davenheim on a country drive, I saw the manor reborn, open to visitors, its rooms staged for heritage and learning. The music room stood empty but elegant, and the cabinet that once held the Sapphire Mask was now filled with nothing but air. A small brass plaque beneath it read, "In memory of what was hidden, and what must always be revealed." Shortly before Christmas, I asked him, as we decorated our modest sitting room with fir branches and lamplight, if the case had changed his view of the world. "Nan," he said, "but it reminded me why I do what I do, which is to restore order. Yes, but also to give voice to those the world has forgotten." He placed a small ornament on the tree, a sapphire blue glass bauble. "No more masks, Hastings, not for now." And with that, he settled into his chair, sipped his tisane, and closed his eyes, not asleep, merely still, at peace.